"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The voice was sharp, a crisp edge of authority honed on the drill fields and in lecture halls, not in the mud and blood of real conflict. It belonged to a young lieutenant, her uniform so perfectly pressed it seemed to repel the very idea of a wrinkle. Her name tag read Finch. She stood with her hands on her hips, blocking the entrance to the main seating area of the graduation field. "This section is for distinguished guests and ticketed family members only." Stanley Blake said nothing. He simply held up his ticket, the paper slightly soft from the nervous grip of his hand. He was 84 years old, a man built of quiet dignity and patience earned over a lifetime of sunrises. His back was a little stooped, his face a roadmap of years, but his eyes were clear and steady. He had driven 7 hours to be here, to see his grandson Michael graduate, to see the boy become part of a legacy Stanley himself had helped to forge. "That's a general admission ticket," a second voice added, this one belonging to a burly sergeant named Miller who stood beside Lieutenant Finch. He had the solid, immovable look of a security guard who enjoyed the simple power of saying no. "General admission is over there," he said, gesturing with a thumb toward a set of distant sun-bleached bleachers far from the parade deck. "You seem to have gotten yourself lost, old man." The term hung in the air, thick and dismissive. Old man. Stanley's gaze didn't waver. He simply looked past them, toward the manicured green field where neat rows of cadets stood in formation, a sea of dress uniforms shimmering in the morning sun. He could just make out Michael's company, third from the left. "I just want to get a little closer," Stanley said, his voice quiet but firm. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." Lieutenant Finch exchanged a look with Sergeant Miller. It was a glance that conveyed a shared impatience, a silent agreement that they were dealing with a doddering elder who couldn't follow simple instructions. The crowd was beginning to build around the entrance. Other families in their Sunday best, their faces bright with pride and excitement. They flowed around the small point of conflict, their chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the tightening knot of tension at the gate. "Sir, the rules are the rules for a reason," Finch stated, her tone shifting from authoritative to condescending, the way one might speak to a confused child. "We need to keep these walkways clear for the official party. Now if you'll just move along to the general seating, we can avoid any further unpleasantness." Stanley didn't move. It wasn't defiance, not yet. It was a simple refusal to be dismissed, to be herded away from one of the proudest moments of his life like a stray animal. He had earned his place in the world, had paid for it with his youth, with his blood, with the ghosts he still carried in the quiet hours of the night. He wasn't about to be pushed aside by two uniformed children who saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. The confrontation began to draw more direct stares. People in the queue slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued. A low murmur rippled through the immediate crowd. The spectacle was starting, an old man holding his ground against the unyielding face of military bureaucracy. "What seems to be the problem here?" Finch's voice rose slightly, taking on a performative quality for the benefit of the onlookers. "This man is refusing to comply with a lawful order." Sergeant Miller stepped forward, his bulk intentionally imposing. He lowered his voice, a theatrical show of trying to de-escalate, but the threat was unmistakable. "Listen, Pops, you can walk over to those bleachers, or we can escort you off the base entirely. The choice is yours. We have a graduation to run here." Stanley looked from the sergeant's stony face to the lieutenant's impatient glare. He saw in their eyes a complete lack of understanding. They saw a frail, confused senior citizen, perhaps a little deaf, a little stubborn. They didn't see the man who had held his dying friend in his arms in a forgotten jungle, the man who had memorized the weight of a rifle, the smell of cordite, the chilling sound of silence after a firefight. They saw a relic, not a foundation. He adjusted the simple windbreaker he wore. It was old and faded, a comfortable companion for a long drive. Beneath the sleeve, hidden from view, was another kind of uniform, one he had worn for a lifetime. He felt a familiar calm settle over him, the quiet focus that came when a situation was about to tip. He had been in far worse spots than this, facing down men with far more than just harsh words and a bad attitude. "My grandson is out there," Stanley said again, his voice as steady as a rock. "I'm not going to the bleachers." Finch's patience finally snapped. "That's it," she declared, her voice ringing out sharp and final. "Sergeant, remove him from the premises. He's creating a public disturbance." Sergeant Miller's hand clasped Stanley's upper arm. The grip was firm, meant to intimidate, to force compliance. He started to pull the old man away from the gate, turning him toward the main road that led out of the base. The crowd parted, their whispers turning to open stares of pity and disapproval. It was a small, ugly moment of humiliation, a public shaming of an old man who only wanted to see his grandson graduate. As Miller pulled, Stanley's jacket sleeve slid up his forearm by a few inches. The movement exposed a small patch of weathered skin just below his elbow. There, faded by decades of sun and time, was a tattoo. It was a strange, intricate design, missed by the casual glance. It depicted a curved scythe, its blade cradling a constellation of 3 stars. It was a symbol that meant nothing to the lieutenant or the sergeant or the dozens of onlookers. It was an echo from a secret world, a ghost of a forgotten war. For a fleeting second, the bright sunlit parade ground vanished from Stanley's mind. The scent of cut grass and perfume was replaced by the smell of mud and monsoon rain. The cheerful sounds of the crowd faded, replaced by the drip of water from a jungle canopy. He saw the tattoo not on his own aged arm, but on the firm young arm of his brother-in-arms, Dave, as they huddled in the dark, the enemy just yards away. A silent promise inked into their skin with a makeshift needle, a mark of a brotherhood forged in a place that officially did not exist. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, a flash of lightning from a distant storm. But the feeling remained, the quiet strength, the unyielding resolve. A few yards away, leaning against a crowd barrier, was a young Army Staff Sergeant named Evans. He was on crowd control duty, and he had been watching the entire exchange with a growing sense of unease. He had seen lieutenants like Finch before, full of policy and procedure but lacking in judgment. He had seen NCOs like Miller, who mistook brute authority for leadership. But what held his attention was the old man. There was a stillness about him, a complete lack of panic that Evans recognized. He'd seen it in the eyes of the old-timers, the veterans of Vietnam and Korea who sometimes came to the base. It was the look of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had survived it. When Miller grabbed the man's arm and the sleeve slipped, Evans caught a glimpse of the tattoo. He blinked. He had seen that symbol once before, in a dusty classified file he had helped his commanding officer archive. It was a unit that was spoken of only in whispers, a phantom force from a war shrouded in secrets. Orion's Scythe, a unit so clandestine, its records were still sealed. The men who wore that mark were legends, ghosts of the highest caliber. A cold dread washed over Sergeant Evans. He knew with absolute certainty that Lieutenant Finch and Sergeant Miller were making a mistake of catastrophic proportions. They weren't just disrespecting an old man, they were desecrating a living piece of military history. He was just a staff sergeant. Directly confronting a lieutenant in public was a career-ending move. But doing nothing felt like a betrayal of everything he was supposed to stand for. His mind raced. Who could fix this? Who had the authority to stop this train wreck before it reached its inevitable conclusion? The base commander was on the dais. The guest of honor, a 4-star general, was due to speak any minute. There was only one person on the base who had the institutional knowledge and the informal power to cut through the chain of command like a hot knife through butter. The base command sergeant major. Evans pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He found the number for the command sergeant major's office, a number he had saved for the direst of emergencies. This, he decided, qualified. He turned his back to the scene, shielding the phone with his body as he spoke in a low, urgent whisper. Sergeant Major, this is Staff Sergeant Evans on the parade deck. I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but you need to get down to Gate C immediately. Lieutenant Finch and Sergeant Miller are... They're forcibly removing an elderly gentleman, a veteran. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then the gravelly voice of the command sergeant major. What's he done, Evans? Nothing, Sergeant Major. Absolutely nothing. He was just trying to get to his seat for his grandson's graduation. But sir, that's not the point. I saw something on his arm. Evans took a breath. I think I saw an Orion scythe. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched for 3, then 4, then 5 seconds. It was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. When the command sergeant major finally spoke, his voice had lost all its casual authority. It was tight, strained, and filled with a terrifying urgency. Hold your position, Sergeant. Do not let them leave the base with that man. I don't care what you have to do. Stop them. I'm on my way. Inside the base headquarters, Command Sergeant Major Rivera slammed the phone down. He was a man who had seen 3 decades of service, and his face was a testament to every one of them. He moved with a speed that belied his age, storming out of his office and down the hall toward the general's temporary suite. He didn't bother knocking on the aide's door, he simply burst in, causing the young captain to jump to his feet. I need to see the general, now, Rivera commanded. He's reviewing his speech, Sergeant Major. He asked not to be. The aide began, but Rivera cut him off with a look. You get me in that room or I will walk through that door myself. The aide's face went pale. He swallowed hard and knocked once on the inner door before pushing it open. General Marcus Thorne, the 4-star commander of all army forces in the region, looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. He was a man of immense presence, his dress uniform covered in the ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime of command. "Sergeant Major, this had better be important," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "It is, sir," Rivera said, his breathing heavy. "A call from the parade deck. Security is ejecting an elderly civilian." The NCO on site identified a tattoo, an Orion scythe. He paused, then added, "The guest's name is Stanley Blake." General Thorne's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly hardened into something akin to fury. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Stanley Blake, the ghost of the valley, the man from the night of the silent storm, a living legend whose entire existence was a classified secret. The general stood up, kicking his chair back. The papers on his desk scattered to the floor, forgotten. His face was a mask of cold, controlled rage. "Get the car," he said to his aide, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get the car now. And you," he said, pointing to Rivera, "you're with me." Back at the gate, Finch and Miller had successfully muscled Stanley away from the crowd and were steering him down a path that led to the parking lot. Their victory, however, was short-lived. Staff Sergeant Evans, acting on the Sergeant Major's orders, had suddenly appeared in their path. "Sir, ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Evans said, trying to sound as neutral as possible. "Get out of the way, Sergeant," Miller grunted, trying to push past him. "With all due respect, I think we should wait for this to be clarified by a senior NCO," Evans insisted, standing his ground. Lieutenant Finch stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Are you disobeying a direct order from an officer, Sergeant Evans? Because my next call will be to the MPs. This old man is a trespasser, and you are now interfering with his removal." She jabbed a finger toward Stanley, who stood by patiently, watching the internal power struggle with a detached calm. "We can do this the easy way, or we can spend the rest of the day in a holding cell. A trip to the MPs and a nice long psych evaluation might be in order for anyone who continues to cause problems." It was the ultimate overreach, the final, irrevocable step past the point of no return. The threat to have an old man psychologically evaluated for wanting to see his grandson graduate was an act of such profound arrogance and disrespect that it seemed to suck the air out of the immediate vicinity. Before Evans could respond, the piercing sound of a command siren cut through the air. It wasn't the frantic wail of an ambulance or the aggressive whoop of a police car. It was the deep, authoritative siren of a high-ranking flag officer's escort. A long black command vehicle with 4-star flags mounted on its fenders came tearing down the road, its tires screeching as it pulled to a sharp halt just feet away from the small group. The doors flew open. Command Sergeant Major Rivera emerged from the passenger side, his face a thundercloud. And from the back, General Marcus Thorne emerged, his 6'4" frame radiating an aura of pure, unadulterated fury. Lieutenant Finch and Sergeant Miller froze, their mouths agape. They snapped to attention, their bodies rigid with shock and fear. The arrival of a 4-star general at a minor gate dispute was so far outside the realm of possibility that it felt like a hallucination. General Thorne didn't even glance at them. His eyes, burning with an intense fire, were locked on one person and one person only, Stanley Blake. He strode forward, his boots thudding on the pavement with purpose. He stopped directly in front of Stanley, his gaze dropping to the old man's forearm, where the sleeve had once again slipped, revealing the faded tattoo of the scythe and the stars. The general's entire posture changed. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent respect. His body, which had been coiled with rage, now straightened into the most perfect ramrod-straight position of attention he had ever held. Then, in an act that sent a shockwave of disbelief through everyone watching, General Marcus Thorne raised his hand to his brow and rendered a slow, deliberate, perfect salute. He did not salute Finch or Miller. He did not salute Sergeant Evans. He saluted the old man in the faded windbreaker. "Mr. Blake." The general's voice was thick with emotion, but it carried across the now silent area. "It is an honor, sir." The crowd, which had been watching from a distance, was utterly silent. They could not comprehend what they were seeing. A 4-star general, a man who commanded armies, was saluting a civilian who had just been manhandled and called an old man. Keeping his salute, General Thorne turned his head slightly, his eyes boring into Lieutenant Finch and Sergeant Miller, who looked as if they might faint. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. They could only shake their heads, their faces ashen. The general lowered his salute but kept his eyes locked on them. "You stand in the presence of living history. In the darkest days of a forgotten war, there was a unit that didn't exist. They went where no one else could go, did what no one else could do. They were called Orion's Scythe. They were ghosts. He turned his gaze back to Stanley, but his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. This man is Stanley Blake. In a battle that has no name, in a place that isn't on any map. Then Sergeant Blake held a ridge alone for 6 hours against an entire enemy company. When his platoon was cut off, surrounded and marked for death, he single-handedly created a path for their escape, an act of such impossible valor it was classified for 50 years. He saved every single man in his unit, including a young green lieutenant who would one day become my father. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The story, the raw, undeniable truth of it, settled over them. They were not looking at a confused old man. They were looking at a hero of the highest order. They were looking at a legend. General Thorne finally turned his full attention to the two trembling figures in front of him. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You two will be in my office at 1600 hours. You will bring your service records, and you will be prepared to explain to me in excruciating detail why you felt it was appropriate to humiliate a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. Your careers, as you know them, are now under my personal and undivided review." He then turned back to Stanley, his expression softening completely. "Stanley, on behalf of the entire United States Army, I apologize. I am so deeply sorry." Stanley Blake simply raised a hand and placed it on the general's arm. "They're just kids, Marcus," he said, his voice filled with a grace that was almost heartbreaking. "They're wearing the uniform. They were doing what they thought was right. Don't be too hard on them. The uniform deserves respect, no matter who is in it." For a moment, as he looked at the young, terrified faces of the lieutenant and the sergeant, Stanley was somewhere else again. He was back in the humid darkness of a jungle monsoon, huddled under a makeshift tarp. A young soldier, a boy from Alabama with a steady hand, was using a sharpened bamboo sliver and a pot of ink made from ash and river water. He was carefully etching the Scythe of Orion onto Stanley's arm. It wasn't a mark of defiance. It was a pact, a symbol that they were there for each other, that they were a brotherhood. It was a promise to remember, even if the world forgot. The uniform they wore then was mud and sweat and blood. The uniform Finch and Miller wore now was a symbol of that same promise, and Stanley knew better than anyone that sometimes the weight of it was too much for young shoulders to bear. General Thorne personally escorted Stanley through the gate, past the stunned crowd, and straight to the VIP seating area on the main dais. He was given the seat of honor, right next to the general himself. Out on the field, Cadet Michael Blake, standing in formation, saw his grandfather being seated next to the reviewing officer. He blinked, his face a mask of utter confusion, which slowly morphed into a look of overwhelming pride. His grandfather, the quiet man who fixed lawnmowers and told bad jokes, was sitting next to a 4-star general. The fallout from the incident was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Finch and Sergeant Miller were formally reprimanded, but instead of being discharged on Stanley's quiet recommendation to the general, they were reassigned. They were tasked with helping to develop and lead a new mandatory training program for all base personnel, a course focused on veteran relations, on recognizing the signs of past trauma, and on the simple, vital importance of showing respect to the generations who had come before. Weeks later, in the quiet hall of a local VFW post, Stanley Blake was sipping a cup of coffee. The door opened and a young woman in civilian clothes walked in, looking hesitant. It was Karen Finch. She walked over to his table, her eyes downcast. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to apologize, in person. There's no excuse for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I am so sorry." Stanley looked up at her, and his eyes held no anger, only a gentle understanding. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said softly. "Tell me about yourself." He knew that true change didn't come from punishment,